And with regard to the regulatory framework, there's been progress made in rules and laws related to this structural obstacle, and examples such as Guatemala with the national employment policy with the gender perspective show that this axis has been applied to a greater extent to untangle this issue related to socioeconomic inequality at regional level. And then also we have another obstacle of the sexual division of work and the unfair distribution of care. And we did an exercise in terms of indicators, and we wanted to share this with you. The logic is, if women contribute 100% of household income, what happens with their time for unpaid work and care at home? And what we see is that although women contribute 0% of the household income or 100% of the household income, nevertheless, the time burden dedicated to unpaid work is always much greater than for men. And so in the case of women who are working in the labor market who are the providers, nevertheless, their burden of unpaid work is higher than for the men of the household, and whom we understand are making no economic contribution. And this has to do with a conceptual proposal presented yesterday by the Executive Secretary with regard to what we're proposing in the position document, and that is to consider the care economy in its full complexity. Here we wanted to include all aspects of the care economy, market-related as well as household-related. And so here in this circle, we see not only the provision of care through the market, such as kindergartens or day centers for the elderly or health services, but also exclusive provision by households, and where all and some do unpaid work, unpaid care. But in that intersection on the dotted side of the wheel, we see that households should be nourished not only by the unpaid work of its members, but the provision in the market through employment, or paid household work. And so all dimensions of the care economy, we wanted to include them here, characterizing each third of this diagram that represents, we understand, all aspects of care in the market as well as households. Now, how can we untangle this situation to put an end to the unfair organization of work? Well, we have initiatives that have brought us great satisfaction, some of which we have shared in our technical support. And once again, institutionality appears as an implementation pillar given priority by countries. In the case of Costa Rica and Chile and Uruguay, they've highlighted the institutional fortitude to anchor care in the agenda of public policy. But second, here we also see communication. And this is quite innovative to a certain extent, because there are countries that have campaigns on care. That, as the chair, Nadine, was saying, this has an impact on the culture and, in fact, breaks or dismantles stereotypes, cultural stereotypes. As you know, my heart lies with the gender statistics, and we have great news here. 3 years, or rather, the last 3 years, we have been the report with 10 countries that have surveyed this, and we accompany, especially the case of Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Paraguay, and Chile, with their first official surveys at national level. And so we believe that this is a substantive step ahead in terms of producing information and this link between the production of information and the design of informed public policy. So these two axes, communication and information systems, are here to untangle this obstacle. The third obstacle has to do with violence and the culture of privilege. And with these patterns of patriarchal relations between men and women as yet, and as you know, this is a critical indicator, femicide. Now, the interesting thing from the analytical viewpoint is that we've made significant headway in collecting information, and countries have greatly improved their ability to systematize the information. And so today we have 31 countries that report information to the observatory, and where we can already follow up on the number of women who died on account of femicide, as well as the rate in proportion to the population of the country. Quite clearly, this is an extreme phenomenon, and I will not dwell on this specifically, but the news is that we're moving ahead in producing information, and this, of course, accompanies a better public policy. Now, here, we've highlighted for the implementation, the norm regulatory framework, and this means that we have a new wave of laws with regard to violence, characterizing not only femicide, but also gender-based violence, and this is progress reported by several countries. Now, of course, institutional architecture, the information systems, and I was saying these improvements in the relaying information on femicide, and then cooperation and capacity building and strengthening, which are essential. The concentration of power and hierarchical relations between men and women. We're very proud of the work done not only with the national statistics offices, but always hand in hand with mechanisms for the advancement of women and the agencies responsible for the elections, and these offices that see the results of elections in the country. And of course, the most traditional indicators, cabinets and legislators. We are the region with most information on women at local level. Women's engagement in town halls, as well as the subnational government level. And this has been a partnership with UN Women. They are the custodian of following up on the SDG 5 indicator. And as I say, in this process, we've had excellent outcomes to see exactly where are our women at subnational government level. Now, with regard to inequality, the regulatory framework promotes promoting parity between men and women, and capacity building and strengthening with women's leadership at local level, national level, with nice examples in some countries, and where we've seen an effort to bring women closer to politics and possibility of being elected at national level, as well as in countries with a very high rates of indigenous people, indigenous women, and rural women for capacity building and strengthening their political engagement. Now, the crucial part here, aside from presenting the work, is to hear our panelists who've come in with information and the experience of implementing the strategy in the countries of the region, but also those countries that so enthusiastically have drafted their reports. Some, we must confess, almost 200 pages long, with a tremendous amount of information, but very well documented. And it's been fascinating to see all the data, information, statistics, and laws that hopefully you will see reflected not only in the report, but in what is shared by the observatory from the statistical view, as well as our repository of the laws. And so I will wrap up by saying that 3 years after adopting the strategy, there is a true roadmap for mainstreaming gender policy in countries. And here we see government transition, yes, but also progress in state policy. It is possible to implement an analytical framework to improve the structural conditions for gender equality. There is a repositioning and a hierarchy for the advancement of women, and with a gender cross-cutting and the outputs of the equality policy, equality among men and women, e.g., but also development plans and strategy, as in the case of Costa Rica, and where the development plan, in line with the 2030 agenda, is a gender cross-cut in order to comply with all 17 aims of the 2030 agenda, may be cross-cut by gender, so that no one is left behind, promoting synergies between the regional agenda, SDGs, and national priorities, of course, and include a multi-sectoral approach to respond to multidimensional issues. Also very much present in the proposed document yesterday, where clearly women in our region are not homogeneous and where diversity must be addressed, identified, and responded to for each sector and sphere where women are active in our countries. The speed and the depth of this implementation of the strategy has been different in different countries. As I said, institutionality, regulatory framework, and the information system seem to be the three main ones in the last 3 years. Nevertheless, we see a slower implementation of other measures related to financing, technology, cooperation, monitoring, and follow-up. We're not surprised, but we find it enthusing, because these pillars, financing, technology, and so on, are all very important, so that in another 3 years we may have a report with already data and indicator proper to the agenda. And lastly, what are the challenges after reading the 25 reports? Well, strengthening comprehensive policies to address structural obstacles to equality, incorporating an intersectional and intercultural approach into the design in Latin America as well as the Caribbean for implementation and evaluation of plans and programs and their impacts on women's lives. Then adopting multi-scale approach to gender inequalities and strengthening regional cooperation on issues such as migration, labor standards, and tax policy, and ensuring sufficient and progressive financing to meet regional and global commitments on gender equality and women's autonomy. And so, with this, I've merely shared with you some brushstrokes that we think are very interesting of everything that so generously countries have sent and shared with ECLAC last year. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, María Lucía, por...
Thank you,
Thank you so much, Maria Lucia, for letting us know the progress of Montevideo strategy and the information as delivered by countries. We now begin with our panel. Let me tell you how we're going to be working. Each speaker will have 10 minutes. We will control time and we'll have some cards to inform how much time the speaker still has. I'm afraid we already started late. We will then begin with this panel. The first speaker will be Mariela Mazzotti, General Director of Women's Institute from Uruguay. She's director of that institute as of 2015. And she's a social assistant, graduated from Ilaria, and she's also expert in public social sciences. She's a researcher from UDELAR as of 86 until 96. She has a degree in gender from Flaxo, and she was the chair of the Women's Commission from Montevideo's town hall. She was general director of the citizen development between 2005 2010 and director of municipal development in Montevideo from 2010 up to 15. You are welcome, Mariela, so as to bring us the progress and challenges in facing Montevideo strategy. Welcome. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me inform that you may use a remote control perhaps to pass your slides on. Very well. PowerPoints are usually longer or take longer than the time allowed, so I will try to skip over some of the slides so as to stick to my time allowed. In Uruguay, the national strategy for gender equality to 2030 has become landmark in putting forward this topic that has been in our minds. We believe that gender policies should be state policies and that they are a part of development policies. We have also conducted this work within the General Gender Council, and we did receive support and we got technical assistance as well from UN Women. We're very thankful for that support. The National Gender Council, that is the public institution that was created to take care of the cross-cutting nature of gender. It is made up by the highest authorities of all ministries and autonomous powers, such as the General Attorney's Office. We also have the presence of social players representing women, feminist organizations from the union world, as well as business chambers and universities. This council is chaired by the National Women's Institute, and they became in charge of this effort. Let me tell you that the National Strategy for Gender Equality went through a process to submit the content to the Ministers' Council and to the presidency. That's where the decisions are made. So this ended up becoming a decree. And the National Strategy for Gender Equality in my country aims at looking into the future, trying to state which are the gender policies within the framework of national development that are needed in order to reach full equality. It's really a roadmap. And in this roadmap, The national strategy has tried to update the regulatory frameworks, has extended the plans and programs geared towards gender equality, and identifying what the structure permits, but that required the pinpointing of failings, and this in turn becomes government commitments. Now, how has that national strategy uh, been forged? Certainly, in Montevideo, that was approved in the women's conference. It was indeed the trigger and guidance. But we also have a 2030 agenda and SDGs. We also feed on other commitments that have been subscribed, such as Belém do Pará, such as CEDAW. And the national strategy for gender equality was defined within, within this framework, looking into the future, looking at the goals. This brings in the political institutional guidelines that all must meet in order to go forward in this equality. It also includes strategic guidelines that may impact public policy. The national strategy for the development of Uruguay 2050 took up our national strategy for gender equality. And this has been extremely important because it starts out from the idea in that there cannot be any gender equality policies that are independent. We must be at the forefront, and this was indeed a landmark in our national strategy. And it was done within the framework of the National Gender Council. So the strategy for development of the whole country that was made by the Planning and Budget Office with the participation of different agencies took up the strategy for the gender equality and states that there are three pillars to focus, and one of them is gender equality. This is a strategy that was done collectively. It was done within the Gender Council, yes, with all of the ministers and vice ministers. And they are the ones who chose the technical group that would be part of working groups. Discussions were also had with the business chambers, with the unions, with the women's organizations, both rural Afro-descendants, feminist movements towards diversity, and the cooperative movement, involving more than 100 players. One of the first discussions had to do with defining what do we mean by substantive gender equality. We're not just talking about equality on the paper. We're talking about building equality that will go through the whole of the life of women and girls. This has to do with getting rid of inequalities. It assumes a full exercise of women's rights and autonomy, which require active role from state and civil society. It involves actions in, for example, economic distribution, cultural recognition, and political representation. Gender equality cannot remain in small programs. It must be part of the wealth distribution in the cultural patterns that promote inequality, and it must end up in full parity. I'm afraid I'm running out of time. I will therefore skip over some of these slides. These are guiding frameworks in Montevideo and the structural nodes in inequality. Lucia talked about this. The studies from OPP state that Uruguay still has cultural patterns and social and economic conditions that repeat inequality, that reproduce it. And it's very important because in our strategy, we realize that gender equality still is needing more work. We took the pillars from Montevideo, and we also mentioned that as key for public policy, sustainable development, equality as guiding principle, information systems, everything having to do with the real effective participation of women, education, egalitarian culture, the care policy and economy, economic autonomy in the productive world, universal health, sexual reproductive rights, mental health, comprehensive health for girls and adolescents, policies against violence, gender violence, and everything have to do with housing as well. Very important in granting the institutionality and to go forward for towards state policy. And this, by the way, was passed as law. And together with UN Women, aside from having the decree for the national strategy for gender equality, we also had a new law on equality and non-discrimination based on gender. And this was passed December last year. And it's very important because a national gender system was created. It maintained the National Gender Council, and it maintained the guiding hands in Women's National Institute. And there were specialized units created in each public organization, a biddable fund for gender equality, budget, gender sensitive, and IT. And as I said, it's part of the National Development Plan 2050. That would be it. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much, Mariela. You were quite punctual. Congratulations. We now continue giving the floor to Elizabeth Gomez Alporta. She is a women's minister from Argentina. She's a feminist. She comes from the defense of human rights. She worked in the judiciary, in the and in the public ministry. She's legal advisor for many institutions. Truth and Justice is a project she works with. She chairs the Project for Peoples, and she's also part of the National Association of Attorneys for Indigenous Rights. Welcome, Elizabeth. Thank you. Good morning. Let me first of all thank all of our colleagues and ECLAC's team who have worked so much in the preparation of the report. And we also appreciate the new session on the conference. It's an honor for me to be here. It is a great responsibility for me to speak on behalf of Argentina. We all in the main governmental forum for women's rights and gender equality in Latin America and the Caribbean. We do know that it is a privileged venue in order to list the basic needs and to implement public policy to promote and protect women's rights. As we all know, 4 years ago, right here, the Montevideo strategy was passed. That is indeed a regional political commitment that is quite ambitious. This allows us to continue thinking, rethinking, and revising what has been committed, what has been in terms of progress, and what's being accomplished in all of our countries to figure out what are the obstacles encountered in getting rid of the inequality existing in our region. We do endorse the diagnosis that is part of the report. We do realize that there are different inequality nodes that affect women with different genders and diversities. We also believe that the states are the ones that have the possibility or the duty to implement public policy in order to change this situation. That is to say, we realize that we ourselves, who represent the states, are the only ones who are responsible for getting rid of these gaps. Regressions exist, certainly in my country at least. In many of the countries, we have seen the implementation of economic models that, by definition, exclude many minority groups, and they are promoted by neoliberal experts with absent minimum states that are separated from the responsibilities and obligations they should have with their peoples. Economic inequality, high levels of poverty, under excluding political systems is something that cannot be accepted throughout the world and in our region. We also know this model that creates even more poverty does have a differentiating effect, as we have been hearing since yesterday, amongst women and diversities. Now, in talking about gender equality, we should look at the existing productive models, models that exhaust, deplete our natural resources, and that affect the people's lives, and even more, especially the lives of women. These means that we should include gender focus in the productive world. Gender equality and the definition of development models that are more inclusive require states that are stronger, more present, not only with the capability of designing, but also of ensuring the implementation of public policy. States that are capable and that are willing to do so. Yesterday we heard about the political covenants, states that are willing to improve the quality of living of our people. As we heard yesterday, in Argentina, there's a new government that has decided to give priority in the public agenda, everything having to do with gender equality. And one of the first activities that was adopted by the new administration in December last year, through president from the presidency, the Women's and Gender Equalities Ministry was created. That was the first in my country. And that is why we have now worked more into the Montevideo strategy. We wish to be more participative, but also work in a cross-cutting matter so that we may contribute to forging a more just society. In talking about the document submitted by ECLEC today, we fully agree with the unfair social disposition for the care system and the unequal representation of women in decision-making. And we also wish to move forward women's autonomy. As we read in the report, this is backed by patriarchal, cultural, discriminating, violent patterns of conduct. Reducing the inequality gap in all sense is important. We know that this affects women of all ages and of all types and of all peoples. In my country, the average life expectancy for a trans woman is of 35 to 30 years of age. And for other women, it's of 79. When we talk about inequality, we talked about this. Trans women have half the life expectancy as other women. Violence against women, we know that is very much related with lack of autonomy and the inequality gaps. So we know that this is something that is pressing, something extremely complicated and urgent. We require a change in culture, and that is why we have taken on the challenge to search for a strategic means of including cultural policies in this new ministry. As a matter of fact, we aim at working in cultural policies in depth. We have also followed training of women and staff on gender violence. There's a law that is called Micaela law in Argentina. That is due to a woman who died from femicide. The authorities then set a permanent training program for all staff from the 3 state branches. And in this kind of training, after 1 month with the new administration, we had an excellent example, and whereby the president of the Republic went into training together with all ministers in things having to do with violence and raising awareness to gender violence. Now, the work to respond to gender violence is indeed priority. So this ministry has promised to work as of a national care system in Argentina.
We will begin working immediately, mapping care at a federal level, and we take on to do interministerial work with several agencies in a constant work group to think of national care policies, a debt our country has, and so we take on the commitment at ministerial level. The ministry that we're just starting out with. I have only 1 minute left. The ministry is a starting point, not the end, but the beginning. It is also a result of the pride that we feel in Argentina of holding these regional and multi-regional meetings for transvestites, and we take on the commitment to have an open-door ministry accessible at federal scale in our country, which is a large country and has a system, a federal representative system, and may build a public institutionality. This leads us to think of joint work, and undoubtedly we need to strengthen historical ties for cooperation and assistance among countries of the region. And so this conference is particularly important and politically it gives us much hope at this very regressive moment for the region. Thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you for the time and your contributions. I am now pleased to introduce Alejandra Mora, Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission of Women, CIM, a Costa Rican researcher and activist for women. She has held many positions since 2014 to date, and now Director of the Office for the Advocacy of Women. And she began in the CIM OES in 2019. Welcome, Alejandra. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here as Executive Secretary for the Inter-American Commission of Women, the CIM. Different to how I started out as minister. I would like to provide an overview and begin by expressing my gratitude for everything that ECLAC does, being able to sum up the great complexity of the obligations that states have under this context, have roadmaps for the commitments, are very helpful to put order to our action and strategies. It's not easy to set priorities, but if we had to choose, what is the path ahead, undoubtedly, for the Inter-American Commission of Women would be the sexual division of work. This is in response to what feminism has placed at the heart of our discussions when we said that we are sexed, segmented body subject to power structures. And it is here that what happens to us as women in society is recreated. And that is why we have a challenge that we must put forward very significantly. We need to reconceptualize the legal definition and standard of work, while work, and as we have said, is a verification and weighting of the transfer of goods and services and not considers reproductive work. All our efforts in public policy to identify time use, satellite accounts, are making visible the phenomenon, yes, but are not moving women to have access to benefits. If we consider this as work, we would have to ask, what do pensions mean, for example? What does it mean that we're all running forward and it's the women who don't have a voice that need to move from a public policy approach to care to recognizing the right to care, the right of caregivers that we've been for many years, and the reconstruction and reformulation of the concept of work. Within the sphere of inequality, socioeconomic inequality, the contribution made by CIM is, above all, work coordinated with the ministries of labor for gender cross-cutting. But there is a declaration called the Lima Declaration of 2016, where there's talk of autonomy in exercising the economic rights of women. And there's mention of several elements, among others, wage gaps, making visible the economic and social value of women, and encouraging participation and leadership of women in all spaces for planning, resource allocation, formulation of public policy. And there's an ongoing discussion on the inclusion of paternity and men within this space in order to migrate and be in public spaces. And here, with regard to economic empowerment, it is also very important to include this reflection that there is no legal standard that allows us to uniform what we understand by economic empowerment. And that is why it's so important to begin to indicate in relation to each gap that we have made visible in rural areas, urban areas, financial gaps, digital gaps, on what is the right invoked in order to make this demandable, if you like, from the state. We've talked to many about this. We have many talks still pending with the entire system, but especially women and NGOs to try and identify that standard and create the regional instruments to migrate from public policy to that we can demand standards in not so much in government processes, but a way of guaranteeing the perpetuity of what we could determine under the legal instruments. The issue of the cultural patterns, patriarchal, discriminatory, this is a barrier that prevents the advancement of rights. We always say that while we do not touch this culture of privilege, as it has been called here, while we do not transform it, it recreates and perpetuates discrimination and violence against women. And that is why it is so important to understand the transformation and the guidelines necessary to have an impact here, especially at times when discourses are very conservative and where they have questioned the gender perspective as a valid one and the only one able to understand the specificities and needs of women. And also they've questioned the concept of equality, and that is why it is so important to include this reflection. There is a contribution by the CIM in this area when it established with the construction by ministers guidelines for gender equality as a good or an asset of humanity. This concept of equality seen from a different approach and the changes that this has led to, and so to sidestep so much questioning. In terms of rights, we always say that this is a progressive process, and right now we are sustaining what we have. This should not stop us from continuing to look at utopia and the path to be followed with our work. Of course, the CIM is responsible for follow-up after Belém do Pará. 25 years ago, Belém do Pará transformed the paradigm of violence by placing the responsibility in the perpetrator, but the state as the major guarantor of those rights. And this means that follow-up must include this approach, recognizing the responsibility of the state is the concept of violence that has to do with prevention, with research, strengthening research, because if you if violence is researched as any other crime, and it's not, and it must entail a sanction for it to be credible. And there's another concept that's not been worked on that much, reparation. This is not just an indemnization, but it has to do with measures that guarantee that the fact not be repeated and preventing other women from going through exactly the same situation. And so there's a tremendous contribution made by the Inter-American Commission of Women. And the fourth barrier or obstacle is the concentration of power and hierarchical structures in public spheres. I would merely like to make a contribution with regard to parity and make a profound reflection on what we have achieved. Amelia Valcarce calls it the third wave of feminism. And this is a concept that allows us, for the first time, to speak not only of numbers, figures, which are, of course, relevant, because a picture of the men beating us is not sufficient anymore. This will allow us to demand the women's agenda from the women who are sitting somewhere making decisions. it is a far more comprehensive approach of the concept that will allow us to make these demands. I think that we need to work a lot in partnerships, recognize each other, to express our solidarity and understand to what extent our differences will help us to work together. So we need to work together and strengthen NGOs because they have the ability to question the state. And that means that we are able to be accountable and be transparent as required by a system as complex as what we're seeing today. So these are some of our outlooks as the CIM. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alejandra. I must congratulate all panelists because you are keeping to the time so well. And now we would like to invite Maria Noel Baeza, Regional Director for the Americas and the Caribbean at UN Women, PhD in Law and Social Science from University of Uruguay, and another degree from Johns Hopkins, Washington, D.C., joined UN Women as the Regional Director for the Americas and the Caribbean in July 2019, and previously worked as the Director of the Division in New York. And she worked as the UN office for project servicing, and for 14 years worked with the UN Development Program. Before joining the UN, she held various positions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Uruguay. So welcome, Maria Noel Baeza. Minister, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Allow me to say that for me, too, it is an honor to be part of this panel with my dear compatriot Mariela, who is, I feel so proud when I hear what you've done in Uruguay. Congratulations. And I really hope that the new government may continue with the steps that you have taken in terms of creating the council, the comprehensive law on violence, the care system, and lastly, in December, the marvelous law that you have told us about. And so we will hope things continue to be like that. And also, Maria Isabel, the new minister in Argentina, we're all very proud of you and this new institutionality that we're seeing created in Argentina. And also, my dear Alejandra, many of the things that Lucia pointed out, you did them as a minister. So well, congratulations. And lastly, say that for me, it is an honor to be working with ECLAC. I thank Lucia, Mario, and the entire team at the Gender Division because it is true, we've worked side by side. All representatives of UN Women in the various countries and who are here today, and also, of course, the team of the regional office. And so I feel that this report is of all. Well, aside from thanking you all, I also wanted to begin to say what Mariela said already. I firmly believe that gender policies are policies for sustainable human development. And so, on this basis, I would like to make 6 specific comments on the report. First, we believe that progress has been made in the region. There's been significant progress in the last 5 years, particularly the national strategies for development that have taken into account SDGs. And that also has a political impact. In the month of July, the UN in New York, there's a high-level commission, and the ministers of your various countries present voluntary reports. This is a new mechanism that arose with the 2030 Agenda. And it is having a great impact because governments voluntarily agree to do things. And we, as always, we monitor. And so it is good that Goal 5 is always one of the goals that states necessarily report on the progress made. And so this new national international institutionality, because at national level we have mechanisms to report on the progress made with the SDGs. So I do hope that this will lead to a constant political will for our agenda. Now, all countries of the region have reported. So I thank you for your effort, and I apologize for being so insistent, because I have more than once called the ministers to ask for the reports. But this means that our region is the region that has most reported, with national reports on the progress of the Beijing Action Platform. And this must make us feel very proud. But it's also a responsibility for us as a region, because we have the RCW and the women's status that begins in March. And there you are going to adopt a resolution, or at least I hope by consensus, and the most important forum at international level, we will see how Beijing plus 25 is doing. And I hope that this week we will have the report by the Secretary General, drafted by UN Women, with all the regional commissions, economic commissions of the UN, and we're hoping that that report may shed light on the agenda still pending, in addition to Montevideo, which I hope will be reflected in the Santiago commitment published on Friday, that we should continue to be the most progressive region in the world, because we are driving the rest of the world, and this must continue to be so. I would also like to speak of the relevance of innovating and transforming our way of doing public policy. Profound changes in the way that we are organizing the state, as Mariela told us about Uruguay. That is a deep change. Creating councils where we have ministers of finance, of labor, and the various institutions that are not used to dealing with gender issues, but that is essential to all of us. Same as we say at UN Women, trying to coordinate the various UN agencies so that the gender mandate is always present, so that they may feel obliged and ashamed when they're not. And that is what we must continue to do within the state and within international agencies, to shed light on the gender mandate that is not being fulfilled.
That's why it's so important that we continue in the same road. Equally important is to talk about cultural change, how to overcome resistance, cultural inertia that prevents concrete results. This document that Lucia brought us identifies the critical nodes and the gaps that must be made narrower to improve our equality. We should also have a very critical photograph from UN in government and civil societies of what already exists. Let me also recall Article number 1 from Human Rights Universal Declaration, because it is still very modern, but it also brings in all of the challenges involved. All human beings are born equal with the right to freedom, equality, and non-discrimination that is granted by the International Human Rights Institute should be applied to all people, notwithstanding gender, sexual orientation, and gender identification, socioeconomic level, race, ethnic origin, or any other reason. I wanted to bring this back because it's still in force. It is it's an obligation of all states to uphold this article. We must remember this every day. Secondly, I'd like to say that now more than ever, we should continue to try to innovate in public policies and make this intersectional nature more present in all of our projects, and also including the great diversity of women, emphasizing the reduction of inequalities and to break through the statistical science. I congratulate ECLA because ECLA is leading this effort in trying to bring more visibility to statistics and also trying to place women at the core of all public policy. It's not just a matter of gender statistics and monitoring, it's also related to budget. As I said yesterday, without budget, we cannot push ahead our desired equality. That is why we must insist on more gender-focused budget, more provisions in the free trade agreement so that women are more included from a financial standpoint. Let me also say that we need more political decision-making space, especially at local levels. It's not just saying that we have a world average of 25% women's participation in our congresses. It's much worse locally. That number drops to 15%. That is why we must continue to work discovering these wonderful community leaders that exist out there in all of the region so that they in turn may be free to participate in politics, starting at local levels and then continuing. These women are the future of our region. They are the future presidents, and I hope we'll have many, because right now we don't have a single woman president. Let me also repeat what Mariela said. We're talking about the regional fund to support feminist and women's organizations. Without the support and contribution made in this sense, we cannot have women's public policy. We have to strengthen our democracy in the region. And the only way to do so is through more participation, through listening more what the women's out there in the streets tell us, with more innovation and creativity to respond to their wishes. Well, thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here with you. Thank you, Maria Noel. We now open up for 10 minutes to hear comments from the audience. We'll begin with the country representatives and then international organizations as well as civil society. Each speaker has 2 minutes, and please speak up only if your comment is related to this panel. We're talking about the strategy of Montevideo and its relation with what's being done in our countries. Please raise your IDs if you wish to hold the floor. Dominican Republic, you have 2 minutes. Good morning. Thank you. Montevideo's strategy has been very, very useful in analyzing women's situation in my country. That is why it's been used as a main instrument for analyzing the diagnosis and thus preparing the OS5 roadmap. This diagnosis was also used as a groundwork for a Planet 3 analysis. That's the plan for equality and gender equality in Dominican Republic, and it's just become public recently. It holds 7 pillars, and these are directly related with SDGs. The plan has the Observatory towards General Equality, and it functions with the support of ECLEX Observatory. I'm afraid 2 minutes is so little for everything I wanted to say, but anyway, you still have 1 minute to go. This observatory gave us the opportunity to be recognized as National Quality Award in Dominican Republic. That was received on January 17, which is the greatest excellence and innovation award offered in my country. Thank you. Cuba, you have the floor. Thank you, Madam Chair. We would like to talk about a challenge we're facing in my country, and that has to do with the structural inequality nodes, sexual division of work, and the care economy, and how public policy has been applied to minimize the effects of this challenge. Let me talk about the maternity law, the L 339 and 340, that was expanded in 2017, and it was published in our official gazette. This is maternity leave that is offered to mothers, fathers, grandparents, and other persons that the family decides to appoint to receive this maternity leave. 6 weeks before birth, 100% of the wage of the mother is given to her, and 12 weeks after the birth, the same happens. But until the baby is 1 year old, 60% of the wage of the mother or the father is offered, and this is something that is done by law. There's a program entitled Responsible Maternity and Paternity. If the mother holds 2 jobs, she receives that wage that she receives from the 2 jobs as maternity leave. Now, and this is done until the baby is 1 year old. As to minimum aid wage, the Cuban state guarantees the minimum wage and even more if the mother can work before 1 year old, and if she has a person to care for the baby, she has the right to her wage plus the wage of the person that's going to care for the child. Another example are the child circles. This was systematized your neglect, but since we don't have the economic capability to expand these children circles, what they charge in these circles is pretty symbolic, only 30 Cuban pesos. It's very little. But if the mother has already 2 kids, then she pays less. If she has more than 3 kids, then she can have her kids for free in these centers, children's centers. This is what I wanted to tell you to explain how we're facing that big challenge. Thank you. Anyone else? Civil society. Please state your name and organization. I'm sorry, she's not using the microphone.
A ver. Soy Miriam González de
I am Miriam Gonzalez from Paraguay, from the Center of Study and Documentation, and we are part of the feminist organization Mercosur FM. Let me first of all say that the regional report was very interesting. I also appreciate the colleagues who have brought in their country reports. But it's very important to once more mention some of the things that are missing, but that are very important for us feminist women, such as racism. Once more, we see that the data bring in only numbers. I do believe that one of the big challenges in our countries is precisely gathering information, conducting research of what's happening in some sectors, such as Afro-descendants, indigenous, popular women in our countries who are being affected. And these are the sectors that right now bring in more suffering to women. For me, therefore, this becomes a continuous challenge. And in Montevideo, we had pinpointed this pretty well, trying to make more visible this situation. And not just having reports showing that women are all alike, which is because that's just not the case. I ask the floor, Madam Chair. Good morning. I am Juana del Carmen Brites, and I represent the World Federation of Household Workers. And I am speaking on behalf of all household workers throughout the world. Let me say that we wish to continue with our agenda, and that this kind of work should be part of the agenda of all international organizations and of our states as well. Our household work should be more visible and should also part of dignified work. We are one of the most vulnerable sectors, not only in terms of our rights, but also because of the violence and harassment we face on the job. Let's not forget we are the first caregivers as household workers, taking care of children, adolescents, and the elderly. We want this resolution to mention household workers as a very important sector amongst all of the other goals behind ECLEX and international workers' efforts. Thank you for your attention. Argentina. Good morning. I wish to express my appreciation for being here. This is fantastic work. And indeed, I do agree with all of those in that we have reached great progress in Latin America that was unthinkable in the past. And much of this is due to the fact that women in 10 years have been out in the streets. As to public policy, yes, much has been accomplished. The only thing is that each country should adopt public policy, and any kind of statistics that is conducted in whatever ministry it's made be divided and separated according to gender. This is going to give us a much better diagnosis than what exists today. Thank you. Very well, we close this part of our work. I will make a brief summary and then give the floor to the speakers for their final comments. It's important to mention that in these presentations, we must have scientific evidence. And today's presentation from ECLEC allows us to follow up Montevideo even further. We should use scientific evidence as a basic for the creation of a sound public policy with a focus on gender. That is extremely important for all of our countries, including Panama. Likewise, the nodes involve pending challenges in many of our countries. This requires deeper, stronger institutions, especially amongst those that were created to watch out for the respect and the promotion of women's rights. Equally important is to say that we must continue raising awareness, not just among state institutions, but also in many other sectors, the private sector, academia, NGOs, all have an important role in meeting Sustainable Development Goal number 5. We should continue doing even more so that from the government we will continue on this cultural change that we know starts very early amongst young girls. It's also important to say that in Latin America, poverty amongst women is still very important, but we should also look at a multidimensional poverty. There are many other things that must be considered in public policy. I must mention what Uruguay has done with the National Gender Council. After this session, I want to talk to the representative from Uruguay precisely on this. I do believe that the highest levels of decision-making must follow up public policy in our countries. The impact of meeting 2030 agenda not only has to do with gender. We must look at, for example, climate change, how that affects women, and even innovation and women's participation in the technological world must be seen because this is good for social transformation. We must conduct many, many efforts to diminish that gap that still exists. The strategy brings in a specific roadmap. We have identified in different countries where we're standing, but much has to be done still to speed up the implementation of these policies, but also not to step back on the policies that have already been adopted in our countries. This is something we must tackle. Spaces for discussion and reflection, such as this same conference, are extremely important to continue allocating priorities. One of them has to do with the consensus we heard of, and that is women's participation in decision-making positions. We must continue empowering women so that they, in turn, may have room and new opportunities for decision-making. But we ourselves must decide to participate in these higher levels of decision-making positions in our countries. The decisions that are made must have a gender focus. We can make decisions, but without the focus on gender, we won't be making progress. These are direct actions that must be adopted in our countries. Now, let us give the floor to the speakers for final comments, and then we'll close this very important panel that does bring in an important landmark in the commitments that our countries have assumed in meeting the 2030 agenda. No sustainable development is capable of existing without reducing the gaps and eliminating the discriminations that exist in our countries. Thank you.
Two ideas to conclude. One, a concern that we have in general, those of us who are in government positions. Government periods, terms, begin and end. The government team, if it is directed by this political will to meet its international commitments and think of human rights and the people, is always concerned with regard to the sustainability of public policy. One aspect of its sustainability of public policy, because we're talking about different interventions. Today we've heard concerns with the possibility of sliding back with the achievements. But progress is ensured, or could be defended, if you like, at two levels. It is indispensable that public policy be always in dialogue with society, because initially it is society that will defend that progress. It is women that take on the recognition of the rights that have been conquered and will defend them. It's the women's organizations, it is the social movement, the union movement, the cooperative movement, the indigenous movement, as the situation may be in each one of our countries. And so it is so important that governments always be in touch with these social organizations. In addition, the other main sustainant of all this is our institutionality. Institutionality varies in the different countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, but it is important to strengthen the institutions. And I'm not talking of the position of closer to the governments. No, I'm speaking about the civil service in general, because they too should be should take in these public policy, because they are part of what sustains the continuation of all this. And so creating awareness among the civil service is essential to give continuity to our gender policies. Thank you. Elizabeth, please. Yes. Along the same lines of what Mariela has just mentioned, we know that it is so difficult to close gaps because we are biting into the heart of the power that has had a ferocious attitude towards women, and it's been universal. And that is why it's so difficult. And so despite the tremendous efforts made by so many of us in so many countries, it is nevertheless so difficult to move ahead. And so the same as those of us who do feminist policy in our networks and at community level, it's important to work with strategic partnerships, not only with international agencies, working with some countries when those possibilities do exist, but also, just as Mariela said, the driver of this struggle, historically, not just at this stage, but at any point in the history of humanity, it has been in the street, social movements, unions, and feminist movements, women's movements. That is what will continue to help us advance. That dialogue is the only one that will always help us to pave the way towards equality. Thank you. Alejandra? Well, it seems that we all agree, we share our views. I would also add that we need to talk a little bit more about the hows when we're the pillars for implementation. What are the keys for the implementation of all this? And maybe we could also include an indicator to measure and standardize things. Because if we're unable to measure and compare what's happening, it's difficult. So I think that could help. I fully share what was said about the partnerships. I said right from the start, there is no way of advancing towards equality if we don't have partnerships. We must look at other partners that must pull on to change their preconceived ideas and have a much broader view of equality. And close with a message that fills us with hope. It is sometimes recognizing that we are moving ahead without leaving aside the need to recognize there are still many challenges, and we must continue to work collectively to overcome those challenges. Maria Noel. Well, thank you for giving me an opportunity once again. But I would like to leave here with three words: power, political will, and financing for equality. I apologize for insisting on the money side. Yes, but well, it is essential. In terms of power, I think that the feminist movement in recent months in this region has demonstrated solidarity as feminine awareness that will not submit to patriarchal chauvinism. We want power, and we want to be at the heart of power. So men should not be confused. It's not a matter of now coming in a little bit of here, a little bit there. No, 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 gentlemen, that's enough. We want to be at the heart of power. And for that, we cannot allow any setback. We've been unable to meet or the full Beijing platform. Progress has been made, but in 25 years, we've not fulfilled Beijing, and we do not have that quarter of power now. It's going to be another 200 years before we achieve it. 200 years? Please. Political will is essential, and that is why I remind you, we have the forum in Mexico, and the political will in the region must be manifested there. We have the forum in France, but above all, we have the high-level segments of the General Assembly where all our presidents will be there. That is where we can measure political will. That is where the full focus of attention is placed, the media and so on. We must demand that political will from our presidents. This is not the cherry on the cake. This is the full cake. We must have it. And lastly, financing. ECLAC showed the way. Tax evasion, tax elusion, pardons, millions and millions of dollars that we are missing out on and that we could use to finance equality. So let's struggle and fight for that. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is a luxury panel, and also I thank you for the opportunity to be here with you. And of course, the challenges are still clear, and same as everything that will be continued to be seen at this conference. Thank you for taking part. Good morning.
Muchas gracias, ministra.
Thank you, Minister. 11:30, we will resume with the next panel on the Caribbean. Thank you.
After like that, and the red light comes on.
Vamos a retomar los trabajos. Para su secretaria ejecutiva y para todos los que trabajamos acá, que es el panel de alto nivel
high-level panel on the action platform of Beijing and Montevideo strategy for the implementation of the regional gender agenda within the 2030.
derechos de las mujeres.
All international institutions on gender equality will be involved, but we're talking from the Caribbean standpoint. The moderator will be Bianca Corlisa, who is a director of ECLAC for the Caribbean. You have the floor.
Buenos dias a todos. Good morning, everyone. Very, very happy to be here. Very happy to see you all here. It is my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to this high-level panel, which offers the Caribbean a special space to share with the wider region their progress made in implementation of the Montevideo strategy in synergy with the Beijing Platform for Action, situating their account in the context of the unique challenges that face the Caribbean sub-region. 2020 marks the start of a new decade of opportunity for accelerating efforts towards the realization of gender equality and the autonomy of women and girls. The Caribbean takes great pride in the role it played in the shaping of the women's agenda at Beijing 25 years ago. This is why representatives of government and civil society from our sub-region are here this week in record numbers to reaffirm their commitment to the Beijing vision for the upliftment of women and to the Montevideo strategy that supports the realization of that vision. Over the past 25 years, Caribbean countries have made remarkable efforts towards promoting increased recognition, protection, and advancement of the rights and autonomy of women and girls. As highlighted in the national reports that they have submitted, positive strides have been made in terms of strengthening legal and institutional frameworks to tackle forms of violence against women, including human trafficking. Several countries have passed domestic violence acts and national action plans against gender-based violence and reinforce the judiciary to better address these women's rights and violations. Nevertheless, the sub-region is still lacking in sex disaggregated data that should support more targeted intervention to this challenge. Another important area of major progress in the region is the improved access to education and increased educational achievements of our young women. In fact, more women are taking advantage of educational opportunities and are even outperforming our men at all educational levels. There has been progress in the dismantling of harmful gender stereotypes in the school curricula and in promoting women in non-traditional employment fields, including science and technology, engineering, and maths. There has also been considerable progress in the political participation and representation of women in leadership positions, both in private and public spheres. Our panel this morning reflects the powerful female change makers in the Caribbean who are shaking traditional structures to promote women's rights and their autonomy. Still much more to be done in this area, though, in regard to the level of participation in public positions at all levels to achieve gender parity democracy in our sub-region. We in the Caribbean are also working to align the regional gender agenda with the implementation of the 2030 agenda through long-term planning. Our sub-regional preparatory meeting for this regional conference held last year in Port of Spain gave specific attention to gender mainstreaming in national development planning. Special attention was also given to extreme vulnerability of the small island developing states of the Caribbean, which all too frequently face the devastating impacts of disasters and extreme weather events. The unprecedented intensity of Hurricane Dorian and the catastrophic impact it had on the Bahamas last year has brought about renewed urgency for gender-responsive climate change and disaster planning and implementation. A further challenge is financing and adequate budget allocation for gender equality policies and institutions. The countries of the sub-region face limited fiscal space characterized by high debt burdens, debt servicing cost constraints that are exacerbated by their inability to secure concessional financing and other forms of trade and cooperation facilitation, given their status as middle-income countries. It is in these challenging conditions that Caribbean countries must not only maintain gains toward achieving sustainable development with gender equality, but also advance this pursuit. We want 2020 to be the year that provides opportunities for Caribbean governments to build a political will and develop new partnerships, including with civil society organizations, which are instrumental in this effort. Indeed, many of the Caribbean feminist victories that have been the result of the active civil society in our sub-region. Therefore, today we will also celebrate the role of these organizations and feminist movements in supporting the efforts of Caribbean governments in accelerating implementation of regional and international gender frameworks. Our contribution this morning is to paint a vivid picture of progress achieved thus far in the Caribbean, while signaling where there is still work to be done. Our distinguished panelists will offer varying perspectives on a range of common issues influencing the pursuit of sustainable development with gender equality in the Caribbean. It is therefore my pleasure to introduce to you our 5 panelists from across the Caribbean. The Honorable Samantha Marshall is Minister of Social Transformation and Human Resource Development in the Government of Antigua and Barbuda, with responsibility for youth and gender affairs. And very recently, she has also been assigned the portfolios of agriculture, fisheries, and Barbuda affairs. A truly phenomenal woman. She has spearheaded a number of transformative programs, including a home advancement program for the poor and indigent, youth education empowerment program, and support and referral support center for victims of rape and sexual assault. Minister Marshall is the first of 2 elected females in the majority in the lower house of the Cabinet of Antigua and Barbuda. The Honorable Delma Thomas has been Minister for Social Development, Housing and Community Development of Grenada since 2013. Minister Thomas has established a reputation in Grenada as the People's Minister due to her advocacy for women's and children's rights and the initiatives she has led for the vulnerable in society. Nerissa Gittins Macmillan is Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of National Mobilization, Social Development, Family, Gender Affairs, Persons with Disabilities, and Youth of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. She has much expertise in youth, trade policy, working as a labor commissioner, and in regional integration. Sharon Warner is the Executive Officer in the Office of the Department of Gender Affairs of St. Kitts and Nevis. She has also worked in the areas of social services, working as a consultant with the development of the CEDAW report for St. Kitts and Nevis, and in her current role, she has coordinated focus groups addressing a number of issues of concern to women in national non-governmental organizations. And finally, Terry Ince is the founder and convener of the CEDAW Committee of Trinidad and Tobago, a non-governmental organization committed to stakeholder advocacy for the implementation of the CEDAW Convention and its mandates. She has worked extensively as a social entrepreneur and rights advocate for profit and non-profit, non-governmental organizations in both developed and developing countries and underserved communities. She's therefore very well positioned to represent the voice of the Caribbean civil society on today's panel. I have introduced them all at once so that their presentations can continue undisturbed. I therefore have the pleasure of offering the floor first to Minister Marshall. Minister Marshall, you have the floor. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Diane. Let me just say thank you very much to ECLAC and also to the government of Chile for having us here. This is probably my third or fourth time, but it's always wonderful each time. In fact, it is a pleasure to join this panel dialogue as we share our perspectives and unique realities as small island developing states within the region. This platform provides the space for us to pay attention to our similarities, differences, and combined strength and opportunities. We are living at a time where we have so much to celebrate as we have moved ahead 25 years since the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and towards our 2030 targets for sustainable development. But as states, civil society, academia, agencies, and private sector come together to review our progress, I think we can all agree that significant gaps remain, and in some instances, we are still fighting battles that we thought we had long put behind us. While we accept that we must secure and protect the gains we have made, we must also acknowledge that there are new and emerging challenges that require a paradigm shift in order to realize our development goals. The reality is, as we try to fulfill our commitments to the international and regional gender agenda and advocate for more recognition and stronger voices in these spaces, we are being faced with challenges that have been described as unfamiliar, unprecedented, and urgent. We are constantly considering whether we will be impacted by tropical storms, hurricanes, droughts, floods, earthquakes, and/or tsunamis. In fact, it was only yesterday that many of us from the Caribbean, as we participated in the opening ceremony, were anxiously checking in with our brothers and sisters in Jamaica and nearby countries after learning of a magnitude 7.7 earthquake that rocked sections of the island, followed by an immediate, albeit brief, tsunami watch. As small island developing states, while we contribute relatively little to global climate change, we are greatly impacted by changes in climate patterns and their consequences. Our vulnerability to these climate events act as a major challenge to our ability to sustain our development interventions. While we remain ambitious and committed to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Agenda, we are mindful that years of progress, gains, and advancements are at a risk of being halted and even reversed with just a single extreme weather event. During the 2017 hurricane season, of the 13 named tropical storms, 2 catastrophic Category 5+++ hurricanes, Irma and Maria, made landfall and caused havoc and devastation across the Caribbean. In the aftermath of Hurricane Irma, 95% of the homes in Barbuda were either damaged or destroyed. Barbuda was deemed uninhabitable, and the entire population of 1,600 persons had to be evacuated to the main island of Antigua. We also saw the recent destruction of Abaco and Grand Bahama in Bahamas. But let me take this opportunity to once again thank the international community for their support as we continue to rebuild our countries. Our Prime Minister at the last sitting of the United Nations General Assembly reminded us that, and I quote, "Small island states are the greatest victims of climate change, causing our economies to decline, creating climate refugees, impacting opportunities for direct investments, escalating costs of insurance, and rebuilding and increasing the level of our debt. The cost of the damages from the 2017 hurricane season alone was way beyond the size of our combined economies within the Caribbean." End of quote. Climate change aggravates the pre-existing inequalities. It thwarts progress towards gender equality by exacerbating poverty, reinforcing traditional patterns of discrimination, and directly affecting gender-defined livelihoods. Women are affected in their multiple roles as food producers and providers, as guardians of health, caregivers, and economic actors. Women still have a lesser economic, political, and legal status, which increases their vulnerability. As we continue to grapple with climate events, we recognize the urgency in ensuring that mitigation and adaptation efforts integrate gender at all levels. Additionally, other intersecting issues must be taken into account to minimize risks to women and children and ensure greater success of efforts to address climate change. Climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is linked to social justice, equity, economic empowerment, and human rights, and as such should not be addressed in isolation. The economic development of SIDS is dependent on tourism, industry services, and agriculture. The threat of sea level rise and accelerated beach erosion and degradation of coral reefs, along with the frequency or intensity of hurricanes and cyclones, have significant impact on the tourism sector. This threat to the tourism sector will affect the economic growth, stability, and overall development of SIDS. In Antigua and Barbuda, women comprise the majority workers in the hotel, restaurant, and service sectors of tourism. Women are overrepresented in the lower echelons of employment in the service industry. Thus, the vulnerability of the sector of external shocks will continue to challenge their economic opportunities. The unemployment rate is also higher among women in the Caribbean, and women still face gender-based discrimination on ownership of land and access to natural resources and credit facilities. The empowerment of women is an important ingredient in building climate resilience. Improving gender equality contributes to policy choices that lead to better environmental governance, whether through increased representation and voice of women within their communities, in society at large, and at the political level, or through increased labor force participation. It is important to note, therefore, that women are not only victims of climate change, but also active agents of change. The strengthening of women's participation in decision-making and political representation can contribute to the kinds of institutional transformation that are necessary to put our countries on a sustainable development path. The natural disasters resulting from climate change do not discriminate. However, the impacts are experienced differently by women, by girls, by boys, and certainly by men. Many people can become displaced during and after disasters. Displacement can lead to exposure to violence and the visibility of pre-existing violence. The Caribbean region has high levels of gender-based violence which can be exacerbated by climate events. Violence impedes economic productivity, which leads to greater rates of poverty and health challenges. Although women face particular socio-economic issues that shape their vulnerability to climate change, and unabated climate change impacts can worsen traditional gender disparities, mitigation and adaptation efforts offer opportunities to advance gender equality and women's empowerment. So in Antigua and Barbuda, we are implementing several actions to mitigate and adapt to climate change, and I will share just a few with you. We're seeking to strengthen coordination between the National Gender Machinery and the Department of Environment. intervention with a special national fund for the implementation of climate change mitigation and adaptation activities. The fund also provides financial support to vulnerable groups, communities, and women to adapt to climate change and disaster preparedness, including for the construction of climate-resilient community shelters. Gender policy for climate and environmental projects and programs, commitments to transition from fossil fuel to clean, renewable energy, and build the capacity of women to participate in the energy sector. To introduce and strengthen integrated social protection systems through a national social protection legislation and policy to assist the most vulnerable. To provide 2% concessional financing loans to households in vulnerable communities, particularly those in areas prone to flooding, for adaptation measures with specific targets to ensure women's access to funding. In conclusion, we stand on the front line of this climate crisis. We must focus on closing the structural gaps that continue to widen inequalities. We need fiscal and policy space, access to financing, technical support, new technologies, the creation of new industries, and a new national development pathway to achieve sustainable development. We need solidarity and support from an international community that understands and recognizes our unique needs and realities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Marshall, for the clarity of that presentation. Without further ado, I give the floor to Minister Delma Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, let me extend our thanks to ECLAC, the UN system, and the government and people of Chile. It is indeed a pleasure to be here on this platform, to be part of this very important meeting to look at the Caribbean as it relates to the issue of gender equality and the issue of protection of our women and girls. I first must applaud those women who go before us, those who ensure that we can sit here as women on this high-level delegation. We must applaud the hard work and dedication 25 years after the Beijing platform. I want to also, I saw in our midst Sister Hazel, and I recall when I just got involved in politics, she was one of the persons I met, and I must say, who have a positive impact on my life as a young parliamentarian then, and therefore I want to commend her for her hard work and dedication. Initiatives and progress made in the participation of women in power and decision-making processes. I will speak about 3 sub-themes on the topic participation of women in power and decision-making processes. 1, 2 things are needed in every parliament and decision-making body. A, gender parity, and B, gender responsiveness. Secondly, women's experiences on the campaign trail and in parliament differ from men. 3, more must be done to continue encouraging women to enter politics and decision-making. Gender parity. Equal numbers of 50-50, while critical mass is 30%. Grenada achieved gender parity without quotas. 46.7% of the House of Parliament are women. But other countries like Guyana have quotas for critical mass, 30%. No single project or idea resulted in this achievement. Different actions by various people and groups contributed over time. Women in politics. Willingness by the political leader and the executive of the political parties to identify and select women as candidates in general elections, to be members of the Senate and to hold ministerial positions in a wide range of ministries. Women are active in politics throughout the party structure, including as political leaders and foot soldiers. Women Arms and our committee exist in major political parties. Long history. The history of women in political office and national leadership in Grenada started before many countries in the region, and maybe even in the world. Women have been in the Legislative Assembly since 1950s, Gotchet Protein, and Parliament in 1960, Cynthia Gary. Women have been in every parliament and cabinet since then. Example, in the 1970s, there were women like Nadia Benjamin and Wapel Nair. From 1990 to 1995, the leader of the opposition was a woman, Winifred Strawn. B, head of state. The first being Dame Hilda Bainu, the first female governor in the British Commonwealth, served from 1968 to 1974. Currently, our Governor General is a woman, Cecile Lagranade. President of the Senate, first one was Margaret Nichols, 1990 to 1995. Significant emphasis on mobilizing and empowering women during the Grenada Revolution. Training. Grenada National Organization of Women, and more recently, Caribbean Institute for Women in Leadership, CIWIL, periodically conduct cycles of training for women in politics and leadership. And I'm one of their products. I'm proud to say that. Grenada gender responsiveness beyond numbers. How is the Parliament responding to inequality in the country, solving problems faced by women and girls, and advancing equality between women and men? This should be a concern by members of Parliament, whether they are women or men. The trend has been to demand gender responsiveness from women, but not from men. This is a burden placed on women, on top of the existing traditional pressure, moreover, for those in cabinet. Women and men have to work together. It is not a competition between them. So all members must be gender responsive in order to get things done. And I want to interject here to say that in Grenada, I am pleased to say that our Prime Minister, who is a man, has last year signed the He for She campaign, signaling that we are supporting gender equality, supporting that he is also supporting women and girls in leadership role. And so he must be commended. But he did not only sign that agreement, he also walked the walk. And if you look at our parliament, 7 of us are women out of the 15. But even more importantly, every one of us have serious ministerial responsibility. The Minister of Legal Affairs in Grenada is a woman. The Ministers of Education, 2 of them, they are women. I'm sitting here as the Minister of Social Development, Housing and Community Empowerment. Minister of Tourism is a woman. The Minister of Youth and Sport is also, Minister of Youth is a woman. So when you look at what we have done as it relates to gender equality in Grenada, we are in the right direction. And so I want to commend our Prime Minister and commend our government for the step that we are taking in promoting gender equality in Grenada. And we did not only sat there and stay as members of Parliament, but if you look at our permanent secretaries, 7 out of the 15 are also women. Our permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance, a critical place, is a woman. And the head of our public service is also a woman. So we have made strides as it relates to involving women. However, there are still many more things that can be done as it relates to dealing with the issues that confront women and girls in Grenada. An example of gender responsiveness in Grenada's cabinets, as I said earlier, 8 men and 7 women, together with our Prime Minister. We have tasked the Attorney General to prepare bills to take to Parliament to reform laws to increase protection of victims and hold offenders accountable. I also want to say that our Minister of Legal Affairs in Grenada is also a woman. This speaks volume. We have directed the gender machinery to coordinate action to implement the laws and prevent gender-based violence using a whole-of-government approach involving many sectors, institutions, civil society. Comprehensive responses will be achieved by coordinating and improving the services provided: Gender-Based Violence Unit, Special Victims Unit, Child Protection Authority, Health System, Policy, and the Court. The Spotlight Initiative will assist over the next 3 years to strengthen institutions and improve service scale-up initiative for prevention, among other things. I also would like to inform that just yesterday, we launched a safe house for girls in Grenada. Women's experiences. Examples of the different experiences include physical protection, to walk through communities and dismal areas of the constituency, heightening fear of being attacked and abused, even though Grenada is a peaceful country, balancing family life with political life. Example, care of husband or partner, children, and house. This is based on persistent social expectation that women are caregivers and housewives. Many of us will differ because we believe that women's place is in leadership role. Physical appearance, dress, makeup. Sometimes women seem to be more calculation of multiple partners. When you are in leadership role, you are given all the men in your cabinet. So while you have a husband, you have to battle in the field where in social media they are saying, well, you with A and B. So this is some of the issues that in the Caribbean we have to battle with. In our party, we have set up a system to provide mentorship to young women in frontline politics and support their participation. On a wider scale, for the past few election cycles, civil society initiated a code of political conduct that prohibits political campaigns from attacking women and their bodies or appearance. The Women's Parliamentarian Caucus, established as a forum for past and current female members of parliament from all political persuasion to come together to discuss issues. Continuing to facilitate women participation and other spaces of decision-making. Even in countries like Grenada, more has to be done because parity must be sustained in Parliament and achieved at other levels and sector. Youth Parliament. Many of the debaters are young women. Gender Equality Policy and Action Plan challenges political parties to ensure that at least 40% of the candidates for general elections are women or men. It also states that boards of statutory bodies, trade unions, and private sector organizations must be looked at to attain gender parity in those levels. As I wrap up, I must say that in Grenada, we have made many strides as it relates to gender equality and the protection of our women and girls. But there are many more things to be done, many room for improvement. I thank you.
Thank Minister Thomas for this very uplifting report on the influence of women in political decision-making in Grenada. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Nerissa Gittins-McMillan. You have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I wish to say thanks to ECLAC, UN Women, and the Chilean government for having me here. It's my first time, and thus far I have learned a lot. And I can tell you, it would not be my last. As it relates to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we look at the strengthening of the Gender Affairs Division, which is one of the government's major achievements in the advancement of women. Previously, there was only a desk. Now we have a whole division. In 2015, the Ministry of National Mobilization, Social Development, Family, Gender Affairs, Persons with Disabilities and Youth was strategically reformed to effectively carry out its mandate in ensuring that all citizens have equal access to opportunities that will shape their social, cultural, spiritual, educational, economic, and political development. This included the reorganizing and reorientation of the division towards a more targeted approach in the areas of gender mainstreaming, gender policy development, and implementation. The Gender Affairs Division is guided by the international conventions and human rights treaties which the government has signed, ratified, and acceded, and is a member of the National Mechanism and Follow-up for International Conventions, which is chaired by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It continues to build networks with other key stakeholders, such as the National Commission for Gender-Based Violence, that comprises other government agencies, the private sector, CSOs, and NGOs, in an effort to provide understanding and gain acceptance, honor the role and significance of gender relations in an equitable society. With this networking and collaboration, the division is provided technical and financial support in meeting its mandate, goals, and objectives in promoting gender equity nationally. The division has instituted a series of interventions aimed at reducing gender-based poverty, violence, addressing HIV and AIDS, sexual and reproductive health, strengthening legislative reform, and gender-responsive social policies. In fact, since 2019, the division has been leading the reform process of the sexual offense legislation through international relations with human rights organizations. However, in spite of the apparent inclusion of gender-related considerations in sectoral and cross-sectoral plans, programs and policies at the national level, the chronic underutilization of these documents in practice makes it doubtful that this form of mainstreaming will in fact be successful at promoting better decision-making and the development planning in the country. There is still widespread concern that gender is still somewhat of an afterthought. Furthermore, the lack of sustained funding and resources to support implementation of the plans makes it extremely difficult to coordinate and enforce requirements for the gender equity. Consequently, there is a need to promote a better understanding and awareness of the importance of gender-related issues and the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And Montevideo is an ongoing necessity. With this in mind, we started soliciting support towards the development of the gender equality policy framework that would further advance gender equality and equity, gender mainstreaming, and the gender-based violence. The staff composition within the Gender Affairs Division has not been substantially increased during the period under review and continues to impede the effectiveness and efficiency. Nevertheless, the national gender machinery utilizes every human resource available with the use of assigned staff, on-the-job trainees, and even academic interns to the division in implementing its program of activities. And on the side, I must say, everybody that passes by, we try to get something from him or her in the Gender Affairs Division. We believe that everybody has something to add. Furthermore, the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines keeps committing in the upcoming period to strengthen the authority and visibly as the national gender machinery in the government's institutional structure and provide it with adequate human, financial, and technical resources to coordinate and work effectively for the integration of a gender perspective into all policies and programs across all sectors and levels of government. And there is a good reason for doing so. As you may or may not know, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as of January, took up its place as a member on the United Nations Security Council. And one of the issues that it is pushing has to do with gender-based violence. And therefore, as it relates to us, being the new chair of the ECLAC subsidiary body, the Caribbean Development and Cooperation Committee, my country acknowledges priority areas that we wish to see advanced at the sub-regional level in an effort to achieving gender equality by 2030 in the Caribbean. These include the economic empowerment of women by providing not only employment and access to microfinancing, grants, and insurance for sustainable livelihoods, but also financial management education to women as entrepreneurs, especially in rural communities, that would include indigenous methods such as Susu. Next, the promotion of legislative and policy reform relative to inheritance that places women, especially in common law unions, at a disadvantage. Undertake qualitative research to determine how women's socio-economic well-being can be enhanced and the impact of gender-based violence on women and their communities. Incorporate gender equality in school curriculum and in community-based capacity building workshops that would assist in breaking gender stereotypes that supports patriarchy. Provision of daycare facilities at a reasonable cost that will enable women to access employment opportunities and provide for their households. Increase public awareness on technical vocational education training opportunities that would provide employable skills and which caters for early childhood education. St. Vincent and the Grenadines has made progressive strides since Beijing Declaration in 1995. However, there is need to accelerate our efforts in guaranteeing gender equality and the advancement of all women. We cannot hope that things would change, as hope is not a strategy. For there to be transformation, there must be disruption. Thus, all the key stakeholders, that includes the government and civil society, must work together in advancing the women's agenda faster. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gittins, for your for the commitment that you are already expressing in terms of your leadership of CDCC and the leadership that you will give to the gender agenda in that role. I'm looking forward to working with St. Vincent and the Grenadines in that respect. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Sharon Warner. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you also to the ECLAC, UN Women and the Government of Chile. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. 60.2% of households in St. Kitts and Nevis registered with the National Household Registry are headed by women, and 53.8% of women registered have more household members than men. Women and children can slip into poverty easily, mainly for health and economic reasons, and also experience different types of abuse. The Country Gender Assessment for St. Kitts and Nevis 2014 highlighted issues that affect women who face obstacles in the access to and control of resources associated with the challenges of employment, poverty and violence. The following examples describe how the implementation of international and regional strategies have been adopted. The St. Kitts and Nevis National Gender Equality Policy and Action Plan was launched in November 2018. The objective of the policy is to provide an institutional framework that will assist the government in facilitating gender equality and empowerment, in keeping with the Sustainable Development Goals and other international instruments to which the state is a signatory. The Department of Gender Affairs is the lead agency in this project and has actively sought citizen participation through the creation of channels for dialogue with the general public and civil society to create an enabling environment for effective participation. Part of the process and produced in December 2019, and a second phase will be completed in 2020. Poverty affects men and women in different ways. Income disparity exists between men and women, as females tend to be employed in the lowest paid occupations. Employment figures for the years 2016 and 2017 show that of the earned wages in the Federation, females represented 48.6% and 48.3% respectively. Government interventions enhance the ability of the poorest and marginalised to manage economic and social risks and to ensure a basic standard of living. The Social Protection Bill, introduced in March 2019, seeks to establish a social protection floor to guarantee each citizen a minimum standard of living which enables them to maintain their dignity. It is intended to extend social protection cover based on eligibility criteria that will enable those in need to access essential health care, nutrition, education, care, and income security in cases of sickness, maternity, disability, employment and retirement. The bill should shortly be the subject of a final national consultation before debate and passage in Parliament. The Poverty Alleviation Programme seeks to achieve Sustainable Development Goals 1, 2 and 10, namely no poverty, zero hunger and reduced inequalities. Launched in August 2018, the programme provides monthly financial support to households. Qualifying households receive a monthly stipend by cheque or direct bank deposit. As at December 2019, 4,000 households across St. Kitts and Nevis were benefiting directly from this initiative. Teenage mothers, in particular, face multiple forms of discrimination and are negatively impacted by social and economic risks. Early pregnancy often disrupts education and entry to the labour market and is often the start of a cycle of poverty. Project Viola in St. Kitts and the Second Chance Teen Mothers Programme in Nevis are long-standing programmes that cater to schoolgirls aged 14 to 19 who become pregnant and provides an enabling environment in which teenage mothers can complete their secondary education. Programme activities include workshops on parenting skills and professional development, career exposition and financial assistance to facilitate educational advancement. Over 200 girls have benefited from this programme and are employed in careers such as medicine, teaching, nursing and law. In 2018, 5 of the 13 teen mothers, representing 38% in Project Viola, were enrolled at continuing and tertiary education institutions. The private sector is currently donating 7 laptop computers to Project Viola. Incarcerated women are also a group who face multiple forms of discrimination. Women are often the primary carers of children who are impacted by parental detention and imprisonment. The Women's Prison Programme facilitates short-term skills training and education for female inmates to assist them with their personal and career development for their reintegration into society. Upon release, some women are faced with employment challenges due to the stigma associated with incarceration. But with the assistance from the Department of Gender Affairs, gainful employment is often secured. One former inmate owns and successfully runs a daycare facility. Women and girls are provided with access to economic and educational opportunities designed to empower them to break the cycle of poverty. The island-wide network of early childhood development centres help women to balance work, caregiving responsibilities and facilitate their entry to the workforce. The Skills Training and Empowerment Programme has an emphasis on certification to increase participants' marketability in the workplace nationally and regionally. Vulnerable workers were granted protection following a minimum wage revision in November 2014. Negotiations are currently ongoing for a further increase in the minimum wage. With regard to education, indigent households have access to support such as school meals and assistance with uniforms, shoes, textbooks and the cost of examinations. In the public sector, more women are occupying senior leadership positions and are particularly dominant at the level of permanent secretary, with responsibilities for ministries such as finance and legal affairs. Current legislative commitments in social protection nationally and internationally provide protection for women and girls and cover social services, social insurance, child protection, employment and human rights. The provision of low-cost legal services for women living in poverty has been strengthened. In 2016, the Legal Aid Advice Centre in St Kitts began a thrust towards legal aid clinics in rural areas, accessible to persons unable to afford an attorney at the private bar. A total of 36 legal clinics were conducted. To conclude, state interventions incorporate the goals of the regional and international strategies and illustrate commitment to the implementation of gender-sensitive policies and social protection measures aimed at reducing inequalities that realise gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Warner for that very comprehensive account of progress being made in St. Kitts and Nevis. Finally, I wish to give the floor to Ms. Terry Ince, representing the civil society this morning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is my distinct pleasure to be here and to thank you. Let me offer my thanks to you and your staff and UN Women and the government of Chile for hosting us. I am well positioned, I think, and deeply inspired by this particular presentation and this area that we're going to discuss, focusing on the international and regional instruments on women's rights and gender, particularly how civil society and feminist movements can support states in the implementation of not only the Montevideo strategy in synergy with the BFA, or the Beijing Platform for Action, and the 2030 SDGs agenda, but also how we would be looking back in order to go forward. So let's do a little bit of going down memory lane. I think it's important to consider where we've come from And one place for us to start would be looking at the CEDAW Convention. The CEDAW, as you know, is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's the oldest and possibly the best-known international instrument on women's rights and gender equality. It reigns supreme as the Women's Bill of Rights and structured in 30 articles into 6 parts. Part 1 looks at non-discrimination, sex stereotypes, and sex trafficking. Part 2 looks at women's rights in public spheres, political life. Part 3 looks at economic and social rights of women, particularly focusing on employment, education, health, and special protections for rural women and, and the problems they face. Part 4 outlines women's right to equality in marriage and family life, along with the right to equality before the law. And parts 5 and 6 looks to the implementation of the overall convention. Adopted at the United Nations General Assembly in December 18th on 1979, we celebrated CEDAW's 40th anniversary just over a month ago globally, even as we look toward the 25th anniversary of Beijing. So while we prepare for Beijing Plus 25, it is imperative that we also acknowledge the linkages between the substantive articles of the CEDAW, particularly Articles 1 through 17. The UN General Assembly Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women in 1993 called upon states to take measures to ensure that law enforcement officers and public officials responsible for implementing policies to prevent, investigate, and punish violence against women receive training sensitive to the needs of women. This is in Article 4. The Beijing Platform for Action commits governments to a number of strategic objectives, and I won't name all of them, but I'll list a few, particularly to provide gender-sensitive human rights education and training for the police, military, correction officers, encourage, support, and implement measures and programs to increase knowledge of the causes, consequences, and mechanisms of violence against women amongst law enforcement officers, to adopt laws that punish police, security forces, or any other agents of the state who engage in acts of violence against women in the course of performance of their duties and take action to investigate and punish perpetrators, to create, strengthen institutional mechanisms and ensure women have the same right as men to be judges, advocates for other officers of the court. And then we get to the Montevideo Strategy, a regional political commitment which provides guidance for the full implementation of the agreements adopted by the Regional Conference on Women in Latin America and the Caribbean. This regional gender agenda, makes these agreements the roadmap for achieving the perspective of gender equality and women autonomy and human rights, so that the Montevideo Strategy is both a political and technical instrument designed to support the implementation and strengthening of multidimensional and comprehensive public policies that ensure the fulfillment of human rights for women's autonomy and the achievement of gender equality in Latin America and the Caribbean. It does not stand alone, but draws on the lessons learned and issues outstanding after years of implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action and the Program of Action of the International Conference on Population and Development, and the 15 years of implementation of the Millennium Development Goals and proposed measures to overcome the main obstacles to institutionalizing gender equality and women's rights in state structures. The overall objective, of course, is to guide sectoral and cross-cutting public policies aimed at eliminating gender inequalities and fostering sustainable development. We're at the dawn of a new decade, 2020 being pivotal years for both the Montevideo Strategy and the Beijing Platform for Action. Pivotal as both the regional agenda and the Beijing Platform for Action are being reviewed. It is also 5 years since the global community committed to implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG 5, which focuses on gender, aimed at achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. So how are we doing in the Caribbean? Well, let me start by acknowledging that progress has been made, leveraging both international and regional instruments. These policies in place that are, there are policies now in place that my mother was not able to, did not have the opportunity to benefit from as she tried to assert her autonomy as a woman, a wife, and a mother. All Caribbean countries have signed and or ratified the CEDAW, the Montevideo Strategy, and other regional, sub-regional agreements with the aim of equality for women, upholding the human rights of women and the advancement of women and girls. The question I constantly ask myself and the organization that I represent is how can we as members of civil society work to influence legislation while we work on the ground to raise awareness of the sense and sensitize all persons to the powerful instruments that already exist, leveraging those tools to hold all stakeholders accountable. And that also includes civil society. And further, why are we, civil society in our region, seemingly divorced from the region? Or should I put it differently? How can we get back to a place where the region had an agenda that is understood by all stakeholders? What is our role, and how can we be an effective stakeholder? So what is the role of civil society organizations and feminist movements? Well, the role of civil society is not constant, being shaped by what is happening around us every day, which means that it can take many different shapes. One thing is certain, that is that it can provide an entry point for productive engagement, which includes oversight on governance and implementation, transparency, and hold governments accountable. Civil society organizations are non-state, not-for-profit, voluntary entities formed by people, passionate people, representing a wide range of interests. The role of feminist movements, according to Wikipedia, refers to a series of political campaigns for reforms on issues such as reproductive rights, domestic violence, maternity leave, equal pay, women's suffrage, sexual harassment, and sexual violence. And this list is not exhaustive. So together, we are a powerful force that should be leveraged effectively to ensure that we contribute toward the development of women and girls and make spaces in areas where the space seems to be closed. As a region, the response to international treaties was swift and overwhelming. Countries became signatories and ratified international and regional treaty agreements. The primary challenge continues to be in the implementation of the mandates agreed to, despite templates, support, guidance being offered and provided. While it is common practice to have a space dedicated to women, and I have those women, that women in quotes, either a gender affairs ministry or women's affairs office, and in most cases it is separate and apart from children affairs, we have been seeing a steady escalation of violence against women and femicide in our region. The now familiar recent study on women, UN Women study on women, which highlighted 1 in 3 women would have been a victim of sexual assault before the age of 25, suggests that respect, protect, and fulfill, and the principles of non-discrimination, equality, and state obligations have not been effectively put into practice. So what we ought to be considering goes beyond the issue of having a percentage of women in political office, though that is an essential part of the solution. It is about a change in behavior that must involve a rethinking of past approaches, evaluating what worked 25 years ago or even 5 years ago, and determining whether those approaches will still work today, and then making the necessary adjustments. I wish that we could make the time and space to honestly unpack all that we know should require unpacking and reconstitute the ingredients for success, because we have those ingredients. In the time I have left, I want to touch on 3 points that we can think about as human rights defenders, feminists and members of civil society community, support agencies, and state duty bearers. Good practices, collaboration. Sounds simple enough, and we hear it all the time, but we can all do a better job of following through with collaboration. Collaboration also requires humility. We can't always be the leader. We must know our strengths, share our strengths with others, and support those who exhibit the skills and expertise that we don't have. I have several examples of civil society organizations coming together to affect legislative change in Trinidad and Tobago. The backstories are very interesting, but in the interest of time, I won't attempt to share them all. But know that it was true collaboration with lots of ebbs and flows that led to the eventual success. And the first one I want to highlight is the act to amend the Marriage Acts. We had 4 Marriage Acts in Trinidad and Tobago, which was ascended to on the 22nd of June in 2017. And this collaboration by civil society, faith-based organizations, government entities, brought together all stakeholders. It was one of CEDAW's recommendations in the concluding observations from the Trinidad and Tobago CEDAW review in 2002, so it had been around for a while. And during that time, during those 15 years, there were campaigns, like I said, ebbs and flows, but everybody finally came together. Everything converged in 2017, and the law was changed. The second I want to highlight is the Sexual Offenses Amendment Bill. This is more recent, which was passed by a special majority in the House of Representatives on the 19th of September of 2019. Trinidad and Tobago now stands as the smallest country in the world to have passed a form of sexual offender registration. It also stands as a model for other small island development states in the region. The bill includes mandatory DNA and AIDS testing. Courts have the discretion to determine which offender go on the registry in order to allow due process to balance off the sex offender's right to private and family life under the Trinidad and Tobago Constitution. A coalition of civil society organizations came together and submitted recommendations to the Attorney General's office as the bill was being crafted. Of course, we didn't get everything that we asked for, but something is on the books today that can be built upon going forward. Leveraging techniques and technologies that make the most sense, have the farthest reach, and including the media, works. So let me touch on opportunities. Post-CEDAW reviews and recommendations in the concluding observations provide a working environment for civil society and state to work together to develop comprehensive plans to address issues highlighted in a sustainable way. Immigrant integration, bridging communities. We are hearing and seeing and experiencing a lot of migration and refugee situations in our region today. And bridging communities through engagement and dialogue is another way to another opportunity that civil society can engage with states to address issues effectively. Disaster preparedness and climate action, we've already heard a lot about it, and reviewing of the regional gender agenda. So some new ideas that we might want to consider, because old ideas sometimes becomes new. We need to rethink, revisit the Beijing actions. In my preparation for having this discussion today, I spoke with a number of people, and one of the things that I continued to hear was how cohesive the Caribbean was coming out of the Beijing conference in 1995. And something happened. For a while, we were very effective as a unit, as civil society. We worked very closely with implementers, and things got done. We need to get back to that. We need to develop solutions which are embedded within a regional, global movement, leveraging regional and global instruments that would have sustainable regional impact. We need to reconstitute regional meetings, as an example, engaging all stakeholders, including grassroots and feminist organizations, UN agencies like ECLAC, UNFPA, UN Women, and others, to drill down to the root of our issues and ensure that education is an integral part of every action we take. And finally, we should designate resources for civil society integration, like conferences and educational opportunities, so civil society has a place and takes its place and contributes to these actions. I think together we can all work toward developing a culture of shared responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, for that very thoughtful presentation, which I think is an excellent launching point for us to open the floor for the comments and the contributions of the rest of our room. I think you made some very valuable points about the importance of the role of civil society, even as we focus on the importance of the leadership that governments play in addressing a transformative approach to gender equality, gender empowerment, gender mainstreaming, assuring and addressing the questions of vulnerability of women, addressing in particular in the region the issues of gender-based violence, the role that all stakeholders have as agents for change, the importance of collaboration, as you have expressed. The achievement of that Marriage Act in Trinidad and Tobago was truly a celebration of collaboration, of achievement through collaboration. Very, very hard one. And the issue of opportunity and the greater involvement, that sense of responsibility that all stakeholders have in ensuring that we return in the Caribbean to that passion, that commitment that the Caribbean held 25 years ago. We want to rekindle that fire. I open the floor for comments by others, questions to the members of the panel, any other comments that we have, I think, about 15 minutes to Chile. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señora.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Merely, we wanted to express our solidarity with the countries affected by the earthquake yesterday. We know that as a country, these are complex moments, and that is why it is important for us to express our support to those countries affected by the tremor. And second, we wanted to also take the opportunity to congratulate St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the Dominican Republic that today are our representatives at the UN Security Council. And so therefore, not only being representatives of Latin America and the Caribbean as such a very relevant body, but because it is an opportunity to make visible the gender approach on topics so relevant to the bilateral agenda, peace and security. And that is why we would like to reiterate our support for those countries and let you know that you may count on Chile for whatever is needed in that area. Thank you.
Representative of Chile, it is indeed an honor to have St. Vincent and the Grenadines serving at the Security Council. And in fact, we also have many women as permanent representatives of Caribbean countries in New York. So there is considerable leadership from small island states and from the women of small island states, of which the region is very, very proud. Bahamas, you have the floor.
Thank you so very much, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to congratulate the panel. Just wanting to say that in the Bahamas, and I will share about it a little more tomorrow, but Madam Minister, when you mentioned your experiences vis-a-vis what we just experienced, it just warmed my heart, and I'm thankful for it. I want to say that I'm very thankful to ECLAC for this opportunity. to come and to share and to listen, because whilst we may communicate on WhatsApp and other forms of social media, Facebook and the network, it is a difference when you sit alongside your counterparts from the other region, from the other countries, and hear the shared challenges and the shared successes. I immediately was able to write down several very powerful solutions that were shared as a result of what you would have implemented in your country and your countries, and so I'm very, very thankful for that. I want to say that, again, the salient themes, issues, concerns of migration hits the Bahamas very hard. That's real. I want to acknowledge my minister from Haiti, and yesterday I've already expressed interest in working with them to come to the Bahamas to assist us, because it's huge. I visited Abaco just before coming, and there are houses that have, hundreds of houses that literally were washed off their foundations. We don't even see remnants of them. And so again, to listen to the guidelines with regards to suggestions coming from this panel this morning, I'm very, very thankful for the solutions and for suggestions of ways forward. And just here in this presence, as I look across at Alison Drayton, I want to say that God is my witness. Immediately following the hurricane, we sat in our office spaces for 2 days, and I will forever thank God to all of the Caribbean agencies that came. I'm guided by chair of this, facilitator of this session, Diane, that the ECLAC, they would have sent a team down to help us assess it. And I'm thankful, because I'm telling you, when we're in that mode, we don't see ways to evaluate, to assess, because we go into almost a survival mode. And so, Alison Drayton, you, ECLAC team, thank God for sending your technical teams. And so I just wanted to endorse Minister's comment. We really need the technical support. We really embrace the funding. We really embrace all of the guidance and the ways that you can help us through these times. And so I just really wanted to say thank you, panel. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Jacinta. Any other comments? Representative of Civil Society. Yes, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would like to congratulate all our governments of Latin America that have made major efforts over the last 25 years to meet the commitments taken on in Beijing and for indigenous women in the Americas. Having made important advancements in terms of efforts to include in many of the actions by governments of indigenous and Afro-descendant women. According to ECLAC, in the information given to us, there are 625 million inhabitants in the Americas. According to the information of 2010, 45 million of the population is indigenous in America. According to this, representing 8.3% of the total population. So if we wonder, we say of women, we are 50%, we're talking of 22,500,000 women in the Americas. Despite the advancement made by governments, there are still affirmative actions pending for indigenous women. We need further action, mechanism, policies, and inclusive programs for indigenous women to feel included in all spheres of democratic development, and we need to be involved in decision-making. We call on this conference to take action. All of us who've been made invisible so that we may now take part. We dream in building a parity, multi-national and multi-ethnic democracy to consider inclusive countries. In the Beijing process, and we're feeling advancement in the Montevideo agreements in order to carry out concrete actions addressing this part of the population. Our Latin America, if we compare it, is a garden of multiple colors. And if we do not make visible and value that multiplicity of colors, we will turn our Latin America into not those flowers of contribution made by women, but in a gray world that does not shine and does not represent that multiplicity of women's diversity. We ask our governments, we invite our governments to take action. First, that are open, have the sensitivity and the commitment to be coherent with the commitments taken on these international spaces. We, the indigenous women, are prepared to share. We have contributed financially, and this is not visible. What we need is for our governments to value the contribution made by indigenous women through our knowledge, our traditional knowledge, the protection of the environment, our cultural practices as custodians of food, of seed. How much of that is truly valued when we calculate GDP? The protection and contribution to the environment, how is that valued? What is the contribution made by our people and our women to this America? We invite you. You are our brothers, our sisters. We all should walk together. The call by this Congress is a conference for no one to be left behind. Indigenous women, we do not want to be left behind, nor the Afro-descendant women, and we want to walk with you. Thank you.
Very important contribution, and I think that echoing the comments made by Terry in her presentation, the value of every citizen is to be counted. Every group, every stakeholder group has a contribution to make, and their contribution must be fully valued and integrated if we are truly to achieve, if we are to succeed as agents for change, for transforming the position of women in our societies. I see no further requests for the floor, and therefore it is my pleasure to hand the mic to the Executive Secretary to close our presentation.
Thank you very much. I really want to congratulate our participants, our panelists from the Caribbean. We have made a very concrete commitment since 2018 when we said Caribbean first. And we mean it. And we mean it by always the first panel in our events of course, today we had the revision of the Montevideo strategy first, but every single event of ECLAC will always have the Caribbean first. That is a commitment, and we are trying to fulfill it, because we believe that Latin American countries, we have to have solidarity with the Caribbean in many fronts. And one of them is, of course, the vulnerability of the Caribbean to climate change. And I think we have to make a very firm commitment, and we have done it. And we want to make sure that you, the women, are part of this, because what we are suggesting is to have a haircut of the external debt. Caribbean countries are very highly indebted, and what ECLAC is suggesting is that part of that external debt be in certain way a swap, a sort of a swap, to move those funds to a resilience fund. And in that resilience fund that each country, of course, will manage, we are now doing concrete country studies in Antigua and Barbuda and some other, St. Lucia, and I think St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So the idea is to really be like a sort of a facilitator with the international financing institutions, because sometimes I believe the IMF and the World Bank and others should understand better that the Caribbean countries are considered middle-income countries that and that they do not need any type of assistance. And it's the contrary. You are being forced to ask for loans in the commercial banks, for example, and that's not the way to go. So, so we are really working very closely with your governments, your countries, your finance ministers, but we want you to also be very much involved, because if this resilience fund results, I think there has to be a powerful mechanism, to support women in the resilience part, because women are really the ones that are going to hold the fort of after a disaster. As you very well said, in Bahamas, we did the DALA, the damage and loss assessment, ourselves in Bahamas, and it was very impactful to see how far a hurricane hit Antigua and Barbuda. That's the very day where the international community decided to graduate Antigua and Barbuda from ODA. I mean, it was absurd. And so this is very absurd. So we are also in this quest of trying to put forward the idea that middle-income countries, and particularly the small island development states, need to have a very special treatment, also on commercial front. And what we are asking for, I mean, we are ambitious, but we are asking for something that Brazil did historically, which we recognize, which is a waiver on technology, and you did it for HIV/AIDS. Brazil was one of the forefront in fighting for medicines of HIV/AIDS to take out the intellectual property rights. We are trying to see if the international community agrees that the countries like SIDS should have free access to technology without paying, without a waiver, really a waiver, because the Caribbean countries are the least emitting countries of the world, actually. I mean, this would be great if it can be done to all the small island development states, but at least let's advocate for the Caribbean countries. So these are concrete measures that we're trying to put forward in the international community to support you. And I think also that it's so important what you have done, and I think the rest of the region needs to see how the women of the Caribbean have been very empowered. I have to say that you are very empowered, and that's, for me, an example. I mean, you really lead by example, and I have watched many of you, and as you said very well, in many cases, like in Grenada, you almost have 50-50 parliament, and you have, so there is a powerful force there. So the idea is how best we can really help, and I mean it by UN Women is here, we are here, but I think all of us are here. I mean, all the UN agencies, funds, and programs, we want to work together, and this is what we're trying to do, for example, in the multi-country office review that is being done by the UN. I think what we want to do is really to be there for you guys and see how we can best help. We have an office in Port of Spain, which is very well headed by Diane Quarles, as you know, and I want to say that we are very pleased that St. Vincent and the Grenadines is going to be our next president of CDCC. Let's work together an agenda that is going to be powerful. Let's move it forward. And as I said before, for us, Caribbean first and we mean it, and let us and help us to be meaningful to the things you need. So thank you so much. I really want to thank all the countries here, but I really think that we have to move towards, and I see other colleagues from the Caribbean here as well. Suriname is with us, and I thank you so much. And we have many others that are here. And I also include the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, because I think we have to make joint forces in terms of Dominican Republic and Cuba and Haiti, which needs so much support. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity just to send our message from ECLAC. We mean it, Caribbean first. Thank you.
Muy bien.
Very well. In this way, we conclude this panel. At 2:30, we resume our work in the same room.